The Fallout TV show gets plenty of love for nailing the weird mix of danger, dark comedy, and bizarre wasteland moments. But from the start, hardcore fans noticed some major changes in the lore. From the NCR's entire history to the Brotherhood's power flip, let's break them down. The biggest point of conflict centers around the New California Republic and Shady Sands. The show reveals that Shady Sands got destroyed, and it presents this like the entire NCR experiment didn't just take a hit, but completely failed. Vault 4 becomes the vehicle for this information because survivors from Shady Sands are living there and teaching their kids about what happened to their city and their lost civilization. In one classroom scene, there's a chalkboard timeline showing familiar events like Shady Sands being founded, the NCR forming, Shady Sands becoming the capital, and then it drops a date tied to the fall of Shady Sands, 2277. That date creates a massive difference from the game because Fallout New Vegas happens in 2281, and the NCR isn't some distant memory in that game. The Republic is actively running operations and projecting power across the Mojave. In New Vegas, the NCR shows up in the region in 2274 with plans to occupy and fix up Hoover Dam. And by 2281, they've got a huge presence, including an actual embassy in New Vegas. NPCs talk about sending paperwork and reports back west to the NCR in California. Characters speak like politicians, are still in Shady Sands making decisions and passing legislation. There are even entire quest lines where you can report corruption back west with the expectation that the legal system will deal with it. That's not how a collapsed government operates in the background of a story. That's how a functioning state with courts, bureaucrats, and a working chain of command behaves. Once you put the show's Shady Sands falling in 2277, the questions pile up fast. That same year is when the NCR defeated Caesar's Legion at Hoover Dam, according to New Vegas lore. If the capital got nuked that year, why is the Republic still funding and staffing a massive military campaign hundreds of miles away 4 years later, while acting like business as usual? Why are they maintaining an embassy and continuing to annex settlements? Why does the president still have enough resources and security to fly into Hoover Dam on a vertibird for a morale boost? That specific detail implies working infrastructure, planning, logistics, and command structure at a level that completely contradicts the show's suggestion that the NCR is basically done. Some people try to look at the chalkboard more flexibly, like maybe 2277 marks when things started going downhill and the nuke happened later. But the timeline labels all the other events directly, and the show clearly presents Shady Sands as being wiped out by a nuclear explosion. A nuclear bomb is instant destruction, not a gradual decline of a community. Others suggest that maybe the survivors got the year wrong, but Vault 4 is filled with people who actually lived through the disaster. If anyone would remember the exact year their entire city was destroyed, it would be the people who escaped and then built a whole culture around remembering what they lost. Without the show giving us an in-world explanation, the straightforward interpretation is that the destruction happens before New Vegas, and that breaks continuity in a way the audience is supposed to fix themselves. While some fans shrug this off, we do need to remember that the show is canon, according to the executive producer himself. So this is a huge change, which makes an entire game's story clash with the show's singular chalkboard. Even setting aside when Shady Sands fell, there's a second major issue with how the NCR is portrayed, and that's the question of scale and infrastructure. Shady Sands isn't supposed to be the entire NCR. The Republic started from survivors of Vault 15, then joined up with other towns and grew into an actual nation with real government, economy, and military. The lore describes it as having serious infrastructure, including a constitution, functioning railways, and even some limited air travel options. A state that developed doesn't just vanish cleanly because one city gets hit. Losing a capital could absolutely trigger chaos, panic, supply problems, riots, and political breakdown. But those things have structure. They leave traces and secondary conflicts. They create competing factions, emergency governments, waves of refugees, military units trying to regroup, and a visible fight to either hold things together or start rebuilding somewhere else. That missing context raises obvious political questions the show sets up without answering. If Shady Sands was the first capital, what happens after it's gone? Where's the backup capital? Where did the remaining leadership go? Does a government that size really have zero contingency plans? Was literally all NCR leadership just hanging out in Shady Sands the day the bomb dropped? And even if the government is in complete disarray, information still moves around. The NCR has citizens, farmers, traders, and caravan workers, not just soldiers. Unless the Republic is somehow censoring every communication route, people in distant territories are going to hear that the capital is gone. If that happened before the events of New Vegas, it becomes really hard to justify why the Mojave campaign keeps running smoothly, and why nobody's even discussing it in the way the game suggests they should be. Now, let's talk about the Brotherhood of Steel, because the show's handling creates another major friction point with established lore. The West Coast Brotherhood is supposed to be the original, more isolationist chapter, focused on preserving and hoarding pre-war technology, while generally keeping outsiders at arm's length. The East Coast Brotherhood started as an expedition and made different choices, including recruiting locals when super mutant threats and low numbers forced their hand. That shift even caused internal conflict, with some members breaking away because they thought the mission had been compromised. The show, despite being set on the West Coast, leans into a Brotherhood vibe that feels more like the expansionist, power-projecting version from the East. The clearest sign of this major change is the scale of the Brotherhood's presence, and the implication that they can push aggressively through territory historically connected to the NCR. The problem here is the context of the Brotherhood's scale. Even at peak strength, the Brotherhood isn't supposed to outnumber the Republic. Power armor is a serious advantage, but it's not total invincibility. A republic with hundreds of thousands of citizens and an organized military shouldn't be defenseless against a smaller faction, especially on its home turf. If Shady Sands is destroyed, the Brotherhood still shouldn't automatically become the dominant force across the entire region without the show clearly demonstrating what happened to the rest of the Republic's institutions, settlements, and military strength. If the NCR truly collapsed completely, what did that collapse actually look like? If it didn't collapse, why can the Brotherhood operate so freely? Either scenario requires the show to explain the chain of events, and Season 1 doesn't do enough of that work. This loops back to New Vegas again, because the show highlights that New Vegas is not only canon, but a major theme, by including direct references like Sunset Sarsaparilla, NCR Ranger armor, Mr. House, Repcon, and Big Mountain. That makes it feel like they wanted to take the aesthetic and themes of New Vegas while creating their own, conflicting story to make an impact with viewers. On top of that, New Vegas has multiple endings that drastically change the Mojave's future. A story set after New Vegas either needs to pick which outcomes shape the world, or it needs to be extremely careful about how it references the region. Otherwise, you're just borrowing the aesthetic while leaving the actual consequences unaddressed. And that's a reliable way to start lore arguments that never get resolved, which has already started happening from Season 1. Vault-Tec represents another flaw in the lore, even when the show explores ideas the games have hinted at for years. In the established lore, Project Safehouse begins as a government-backed initiative meant to protect America, but gets subverted by the Enclave into a massive social experiment. The vaults collect data on people under controlled conditions for the elite, and those experiments tie into long-term plans for rebuilding society in a specific way. The show pushes Vault-Tec as openly self-serving and even willing to nudge the world toward war to protect its investments and eliminate competition. The games can suggest corporate evil while keeping the Enclave's structured plan as the deeper machinery driving the Vault program. The problem is what happens when that evil gets simplified into pure profit motive without the larger framework being clearly laid out. Because once the world ends, the basic profit motive changes completely. If the planet is ash and society is shattered, stock prices and market share don't function the same way anymore. Vault-Tec's cruelty and arrogance can still make sense, but lore-focused viewers want to see the internal logic, the long-term strategy, and how that connects to the Vault experiments and the Enclave's goals. Without that foundation, the motivation can come across as greed for the sake of greed, which might work as shock value for the show, but creates problems when it's used as the driving force behind decisions that shape the entire timeline and impacts the games. Hopefully in Season 2's flashbacks, we'll get to see a little more about this, and it'll be less of a problem. That brings us to the Enclave. The show hints that the Enclave has a facility, resources, and the capability to develop major technology like cold fusion, then mostly moves past it without caring. The problem here is that at this point in the timeline, the Enclave shouldn't be casually operating as a strong, hidden power with active infrastructure. The Enclave is portrayed as the elite shadow government that abandoned everyone else, and later as an enemy that major factions actively hunted down and destroyed. So if they're back with enough personnel and stability to run significant research and hold valuable tech, that requires explanation. Where did the manpower come from? How did they avoid getting wiped out? How did they maintain a base and resources in a world where every major faction is desperate for power and technology? Cold fusion itself makes this issue way bigger because it's not a minor prize. A source of unlimited power would transform settlement survival, manufacturing, weapons development, transportation, and the balance of power between every faction that could access it. If a faction can create and control it, that capability should ripple through the entire setting. It should change what's possible, what's valuable, and what factions fight over. When the show treats cold fusion like a plot device that can appear and vanish without reshaping the broader world, it feels like the story is deploying a massive lore-changing concept without fully accounting for the consequences in world building. Another, broader concern is how the West Coast setting feels flattened into a generic wasteland that resembles the East Coast atmosphere. The lore referenced here is that after the Great War, rebuilding progressed far more visibly in the West, with stronger civilization, larger settlements, and bigger political narratives, while the East often feels less developed and more fragmented even many years later. The show's West Coast, on the other hand, can feel like it takes that East Coast emptiness and transplants it to California, as if the region never became what the NCR's story says it became. That's why the absence of major West Coast settlement names matters beyond fan service. Those locations are part of what makes the West Coast feel like a place with history, trade networks, and political complexity, rather than just ruins and random encounters. Put all of this together, and the frustration becomes clear. The lore complaints aren't just about one date on a chalkboard. The core issue is cause and effect. If Shady Sands falls in 2277, the NCR story in 2281 needs a coherent explanation. If the NCR gets reduced to scattered remnants, the show needs to demonstrate how a nation with substantial infrastructure and a large population collapsed into fragments, and why that collapse also seemingly erased most of the familiar West Coast settlement network from the narrative. If the Brotherhood can project power like this on the West Coast, the setting needs to show what that means for any surviving Republic institutions, and why the Brotherhood's presence resembles an East Coast approach rather than their isolationist origins. If Vault-Tec's motivations get pushed toward pure corporate greed, the Vault program and the Enclave's deeper agenda need clearer connections. If the Enclave can operate openly enough to run major facilities and develop cold fusion, the show needs to explain how that fits a timeline where the Enclave is supposed to have been eliminated. Some of these things have been addressed by people like Todd Howard, who, for example, said the Shady Sands nuking happens after New Vegas, which is pretty much just a hand wave and doesn't really fix things properly. So there's a level of dismissal towards the lore, which has caused many veteran fans of the games to feel disappointed or frustrated. Fallout is a universe where specifics matter a ton to fans, because the specifics form the history of the environment the players interact with. Dates, capitals, supply routes, faction ideologies, and settlement networks are what make the wasteland feel like the consequence of actual decisions, instead of random destruction. Season 1 leaves too many of those connections unbuilt, which is why the lore debate keeps going and likely will, even if Season 2 tries to fix things. The show can still deliver a compelling story, but if it wants to exist within Fallout's canon, rather than just borrow its visuals, the timeline and the faction logic need to work the same way they do in the games. But what do you think of this whole lore situation? Is it a big deal, or do you prefer to just enjoy the show in its own little bubble? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want to see more Fallout content, click the video on screen now.